Hello all, and thanks for listening to this presentation. My name is Talie Massachi, and I'll be talking to you about psychiatrist signals of affecting messaging data. So for a moment, imagine that you are a clinical psychologist or a therapist. You're going to see each patient maybe once a week, maybe once a month, maybe every other week, depending on what they need and what they can afford. So you, as a therapist, as a psychologist, are only seeing occasional small windows into the life and emotional state of your patient. But now, imagine if you, as a therapist or a psychologist, had a way to gain insight on the emotional state of your patient during that whole period of time since you last saw them. So in response to this, we present Sochiatrist. Sochiatrist is a system that extracts, anonymizes, and then consolidates social media data for an individual user over a selected time period. What this means is that a patient can choose whatever platforms whose data they want to share with you, and then pick a time range of data that they want to share. They can anonymize their messages to keep their contacts' personal information safe, and then they can present that extracted data to you. Now, in terms of research, having a bunch of messages and posts organized into files by study participant is pretty useful. It makes it easier to run analyses, it makes it easier to hand code for specific events, and it might get you a broader range of data than you would have otherwise gotten. And to be honest, there are a few clinical studies that are currently using Sochiatrist in exactly this way. But when we're thinking from the perspective of a clinician, you don't want to read through pages and pages of social media data for each patient just to get an idea of what they were feeling at certain times. So imagine if you, as a psychologist, as a therapist, have access to something like this graph, where you could, for example, see that last Tuesday, your patient was feeling really negatively. Now you, as a clinician, can either ask your patient about that event, or you can keep it in mind as something that happened, but maybe your patient isn't ready to talk about. So we focused this study on two automated sentiment analysis techniques, Luke and Vader. Luke, because it's very popular when it comes to affect detection on text, and Vader because it's a very similar system, but it's intended to be used specifically with social media data. We also focus only on private messaging data since there are previous studies comparing public social media data and other textual sources with measures of affect already. So in our study, we notified participants 3 times a day, asking them to fill out the positive and negative affect schedule, or PANAS, as I'll be referring to it past this point. And this gave us 2 scores that we can now use as a ground truth for our participants' current mood. So after we collected 2 weeks of ground truth data, we invited participants into the lab where we extracted and anonymized through Sochiatrist their social media private messaging data over that same period. So for each data point in our final set for analysis, we selected all sent messages from that participant for up to 12 hours before and 12 hours after the point at which they had recorded a given mood score. We then tried to detect affect from this data in 3 ways. First, we gave the 24-hour window of anonymized messages to a group of 3 human coders to rate the positive and negative affect of the participant as best as they could. Second and third, we ran each of the automated sentiment analysis techniques, Luke and Vader, on that same data. Each of these values was then compared to the ground truth PANAS scores that we had collected earlier. Unsurprisingly, we found that the human estimation of affect scores was more accurate than either automated technique. We did also find, though, that scores from Vader, that is the system optimized for social media data, correlated much more accurately with ground truth PANAS scores than those found by Luke correlated with the same PANAS scores. You'll also notice that Vader scores correlated significantly with PANAS ground truth, while Luke did not. Furthermore, we saw that compared to previous studies using public social media data, our results using private messaging data correlated much more closely to ground truth PANAS scores. You'll also notice that our results using private messaging data are comparable to previous studies using Luke on other sources of text, such as diary entries or natural speech. And you can see further discussion on why this might be in our paper. Finally, through qualitative analysis, we identified 3 pitfalls that seem to lead to worse predictions of affect that we called mispredictions. The first of these was over-reliance on tone or context, the second of which was message weight based on temporal distance, where temporal distance is defined as the distance in time between a message and when the PANAS score for that session was recorded. And finally, the inability to dissociate positive and negative affect from each other. So in total today, I addressed several points. First, I introduced Sochiatrist, a system for social media data extraction, anonymization, and compilation. Second, we ran a study investigating affect detection using automated sentiment analysis systems, Luke and Vader, on extracted private messaging data. We found promising results when compared with analysis on public social media data, and we pointed out several areas of potential improvement for these automated systems. In conclusion, private messaging is a promising data source when it comes to affect detection, and further investigation seems warranted. And finally, thank you so much for listening to this presentation. If you want more information on Sochiatrist, you can check our website, or you can check out the paper, Sochiatrist Signals of Affect and Messaging Data. Thanks so much.